Cultivating the Sociome, Governance Without Governors, by Eric Moon. Chapter 1, Emergence and Emergent Order. The concept of emergent order as a generally applicable paradigm is rooted in the work of the English barnacle specialist Charles Darwin and his contemporary, the brilliant self-taught naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace. They were the first to demonstrate in modern times that something that looks like design in nature can arise without a designer. As a famous example of this, Darwin showed that the finches on the Galapagos Islands appeared to have been designed to match their respective food sources. Some had large, powerful beaks for cracking tough seeds. Some had long, slender beaks for probing tree bark or cactus flowers. And some had sharp, pointed beaks suited for preying on insects. All of the finches had presumably descended from a common ancestor, but over time they had become distinct species, each with a beak that looked finely engineered, yet had actually arisen through a blind cumulative process. Darwin also pointed to the selective breeding of pigeons to illustrate his idea. He noted that intentional selection by humans, choosing which birds would mate, could demonstrably produce striking changes in a short time. Darwin's leap was to show that unintentional selection, operating over vast spans of time, could explain what looks like design not only in pigeons but in all living things. It quickly dawned on some that this revelation that the existence of order does not prove the presence of an intelligent designer would eventually lead to a drastic reordering of human thought in many other areas as well. Emergence as a general concept is a fairly recent and quite exciting topic in the study of science and nature. Until recently, scientists understood their task primarily in reductionist terms rather than in terms of emergence. A reductionist approach explains a phenomenon as the sum of its parts. For example, we explain heat as the energetic motion of molecules. Examples of emergent phenomena include the intelligence present in an animal's brain, even though the individual neurons are not intelligent at all. The seemingly intelligent behavior of an insect colony, even though the individual bugs are not themselves intelligent. And the rational outcomes that are achieved in market economies, even though individual human market participants do not necessarily behave rationally. In his book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, the late Tufts University philosopher Daniel Dennett argued that whatever else might happen to Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, one novel idea will certainly persist. That is, that what looks like design can occur without any designer. In other words, order in nature emerges spontaneously. The significance of this idea is that it dismantles the myths and common beliefs that the existence of order can only be explained as the work of an intelligent designer as well as an intelligent overseer. Followers of theistic religions often dismiss the notion of emergence and emergent order simply because they are highly motivated to cling to the idea of a creator who has promised them eternal life in paradise. It is not easy, once having believed this promise, to accept one's mortality. Non-theists, meanwhile, may dismiss emergence for other reasons. Many simply cannot imagine alternatives to the medieval institutions we are still saddled with, cannot envision how things could actually work if we gave them up and mistake their failure of imagination for proof that no alternatives exist. Dennett used the metaphor of a universal acid for Darwin's dangerous idea, because a universal acid eats through anything it touches, even a container meant to hold it. I can already hear some responses. Well, I get the idea of spontaneous order, but it only applies to nature. Humans are different from animals, so we can opt out of the natural order and create our own. My purpose in this book is to convince you that we humans have no such option. We are as much a part of nature as anything else and are subject to the constraints nature imposes. The universal acid eats right through this attempt at containment. And I hope to convince you further that this awareness is not cause for despair, but a reason for hope. Understanding how things actually work in the natural world, not just around us, but as part of us, opens possibilities for improving human well-being that give us realistic justification for hope. This awareness also helps explain the futility of many past and present attempts to improve society that are grounded in the intelligent design paradigm, such as national economic planning or pervasive intervention and regulation. So let's talk about those new possibilities. The traditional intelligent design method for improving human well-being begins with imagining a structural model of society as the desired end. For example, many of us gravitate toward the idea that the ideal society is egalitarian, or toward the idea that the ideal society is one where risk has been eliminated. Once we have chosen our ideal structure, we attempt to create the means to bring it about from what we imagine is our lofty perch above the fray. These means typically involve employing the institution of government to impose requirements and prohibitions on individual actions, enforced socially and or legally, and to gain the authority to tax and spend. The evolutionary method, by contrast, begins with the understanding that nature does not allow us to start with chosen ends and then force them into being. In practice, we can only choose means, and those means produce extremely complex adaptive processes and ways of functioning that create ever-changing structures that cannot be predicted or controlled. This remains true even when we believe we are choosing ends rather than means. No one stated this more succinctly than the American civil rights leader Martin Luther King, who wrote, "The end is pre-existent in the means. The end is the result of the means, just as the tree is contained in the seed." New vistas open when we recognize that we have a realistic alternative to focusing on societal structure, and that alternative is to focus on societal processes. Structures are always temporary in any case. Even in the unlikely event that we were to succeed in building the ideal structure we had imagined, events would soon sweep it away. We need to focus on process and get comfortable with the fact that outcomes will always take care of themselves. And no one is truly above the fray, except in imagination. We are all just cells in a superorganism, the Sociome. We, the present set of individuals, constitute that superorganism for a relatively brief span of time. 100 years from now, it will still be the same superorganism, but most of us will probably have been replaced by other individuals. It seems inevitable that evolutionary thinking will eventually replace, or at least come to dominate, intelligent design thinking as the general human mode of thought. Despite widespread ignorance so far, and despite attempts to contain it by those who, for whatever reason, are reluctant to release their grip on the reins. Let's take a brief look at some natural phenomena where macro-organization emerges from micro-level interactions. Consider the order we observe in non-living systems, rivers and their tributaries, snowflakes, clouds, sand dunes. The order we observe in sand dunes, for example, is ultimately the result of the wind blowing the grains of sand, and the grains of various sizes encountering random obstacles, all of which results in a field of dunes of various sizes distributed roughly in accordance with what physicists term a power law. Consider the order in living systems, slime molds, schools of fish, flocks of birds, insect colonies, packs of predators, and herds of grazing mammals. Traditional explanations ascribed the order in living systems to top-down control. The queen bee was thought to be the boss of the hive. Schools of fish, flocks of birds, and herds of mammals were thought to follow a leader. Wolf packs were thought to follow the alpha male. Think of the 2015 movie Ant-Man, where ants are portrayed as individually intelligent creatures that work in teams under a leader. An entertaining story, perhaps, But only if you overlook the bad science, not just the comic book physics of resizing battle tanks without worrying about conservation of mass, but especially the idea that ant colonies operate under centralized leadership. In reality, the intelligent-seeming behavior of ants emerges only at the level of the colony. Individual ants are automatons whose behavior is entirely instinctive and not at all intelligent. Evolutionary thinking has overturned traditional explanations by showing that living systems do not, in truth, have bosses or leaders or choreographers. Order arises instead from the behavior of the smallest components of the system, following simple local rules, and from this small-scale behavior, large-scale order emerges spontaneously. Ants, for example, have evolved responses to touch and taste that result in effective foraging, nest building, reproduction, and defense. No individual ant knows or cares about the colony's organization and seemingly purposeful behavior. Yet nature has sculpted their behaviors in such a way that organization emerges on the macro scale. Flocks of birds, schools of fish, and herds of mammals follow simple rules of individual behavior. Nature has selected for individuals who obey the rules that generate group-level order to the benefit of the members as well as the group, even though no individual can or does have the group organization in mind or any conception of what behavior will benefit the group. Researchers have shown that birds in a flock respond only to the behavior of about half a dozen nearby birds. They react in about a tenth of a second, keeping the flock in formation despite disturbances, even though no single bird is aware of the larger patterns that are such a delight for us to observe. And then there is slime mold, or Physarum, perhaps the most astonishing example of emergent order in the natural world. Physarum is an agglomeration of single-celled organisms that resemble amoebas. It has numerous nuclei, but no interior cell membranes, no nervous system, and no musculature. Yet it exhibits behavior that seems intelligent. Researchers have found that Physarum can sense mechanical cues in its environment and make decisions on growth direction based on what it senses. It uses its outer membranes to detect slight deformations, called strain patterns, in substrates, and it prefers smoother substrates over rougher ones. Physarum forms smart networks by dynamically and continuously adjusting its tubular network in response to environmental changes. The contractile tubes respond to both mechanical and chemical signals. This enables the organism to effectively process information about its immediate environs and produce well-informed behaviors. Physarum can learn from experience and retain memories, despite not having a conventional nervous system. For example, researchers have observed that if it repeatedly encounters a harmless irritant, it will habituate and reduce its avoidance behavior. When it is environmentally stressed, too cold, too dry, or too hungry, it will form fruiting bodies. Specific genes activate in response to the chemical signals that the stress creates, and this triggers a cascade of molecular events that ultimately lead to spore production. Nature has selected for behavior where it is as if the organism is thinking. I am in mortal danger and might very well perish, so just in case I do die, I will ensure that new organisms will develop from my spores and then agglomerate into the usual superorganism. Physarum can also perform what amount to sophisticated mathematical calculations. There's a much-studied problem in network optimization called the traveling salesman problem, stated thusly. Given a list of cities and the distances between each pair of cities, what is the shortest possible route that visits each city exactly once and returns to the starting city? Solving this problem algorithmically has proven so far to be intractable, particularly as the number of cities becomes large, because the possible combinations of routes increases factorially with the number of cities. Brute force computing has not so far been successful at solving the traveling salesman program beyond dealing with a small number of cities. The factorial of a number, written X exclamation point, is equal to the number X itself multiplied by all of the positive integers that precede it. If something is increasing factorially, the results get very large very quickly. For example, the factorial of 5 equals 120. 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. The factorial of 10 equals 3,628,800. The factorial of 20 equals 2 kagillion, like so many spaces I can't even think of a word to describe it. By the time you get to the factorial of 50, you are approaching the number of atoms in the observable universe. We should not be surprised, therefore, that brute force computing cannot solve the TSP. But Sociome routinely and quickly creates networks among food sources that approach optimality, without necessarily arriving at the ultimate solution. It accomplishes its foraging by exploring randomly at first, sending out pseudopods, tubes, in many directions. As nutrients are found, protoplasmic flow increases in the tubes, leading to food. Tubes that carry more flow become thicker, reinforced, while underused tubes shrink and disappear. Over time, this feedback loop produces an efficient network connecting food sources, often very close to the mathematically optimal network, that is, the shortest or least cost path. Achieving optimality in a network solution is analogous to achieving profit maximization in the world of markets. Just as Sociome seeks to maximize the difference between energy expenditure and nutrient value, a business enterprise seeks to maximize the difference between the cost of production and the market value of output. In both cases, maximization is usually not perfectly attained, but an approximation is usually sufficient. Economists call it satisficing. It is important to note here that in the case of a business enterprise, as well as in the case of Sociome, satisficing is the result of selection pressure and not the result of rational calculation. And in both cases, successful operation depends on complex, evolved feedback loops. Remember that the next time you hear someone with plans for intervention in the economy, based on some grand design or other, recklessly proposing to interfere with the emergent prices and the evolved feedback loops on which the functioning of the system depends. Social insects such as bees, ants, and termites also effectively solve network problems related to their foraging activities, and in much the same way as Sociome. There are also some evolved cultural phenomena in human society that demonstrate emergent order as a result of individuals following a simple set of rules. We have, for example, the organization of automobile traffic, which, all kidding aside, really should impress us with how effective it is. And it all works because most of us, most of the time, voluntarily follow a simple set of rules that assign right of way. Markets provide another example. Markets work effectively and efficiently because most of us, most of the time, respect property rights and contracts, and because prices provide individuals with the information needed to make rational choices. By comparing personal subjective valuations with market prices, individuals decide whether something is worth the cost. Collectively, this produces remarkably well-organized market activity most of the time, and not the chaos that adherents of intelligent design thinking believe will emerge in the absence of a visible guiding hand. And it's important to understand that value is a broad concept, extending beyond financial value to encompass everything subject to human preference and choice. It should now be clear that traditional intelligent design thinking is far less effective and useful than evolutionary thinking. Yet, traditional thinkers remain, many of them not merely unmoved by the power of evolutionary thought processes, but actively resisting its spread, hubristically believing that they can produce results that are superior to the results produced by evolutionary processes. Why has acceptance been so slow, even among the aware? The reasons may be unimportant in the long run. There have always been those with a vested interest in the established order. Outdated thinking rarely disappears because old thinkers change their minds. It disappears because old thinkers are replaced by new thinkers. I believe strongly in the universal acid metaphor. Attempts to contain evolutionary thinking are ultimately doomed. As Professor Dennett put it, the universal acid eats through every container. Those of us spreading the word about evolutionary thinking hope only to hasten this process. The next chapters will explore some basic ideas relevant to understanding the sociome and its functioning. Coming soon, Chapter 2, Lessons from Sociobiology.